The attic was suffocatingly quiet, its air thick with the stale scent of forgotten belongings. Emily Thompson, perched on a creaky step of the folding ladder, brushed away a cobweb clinging to her face. It was her first time up here in years, the dim glow of her flashlight slicing through the shadowy corners of the space. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe a bit of nostalgia, maybe nothing at all, but the holidays always brought with them a yearning to reconnect with the past. Shuffling through dusty boxes labeled with scribbled Sharpie, Christmas decor, toys, mom's old clothes, she stumbled upon a smaller, nondescript crate tucked behind a stack of forgotten ornaments. Something about its placement made her pause. When she lifted the lid, her fingers brushed against the spine of a leather-bound book. Its cover was worn, the corners fraying, and across the front, written in a child's uneven handwriting, were the words, Jake and Lily's Christmas Adventures. A smile tugged at Emily's lips as she opened the diary. She hadn't realized her kids had kept something like this. Flipping through the early pages, she saw Jake and Lily's crude drawings of snowmen, descriptions of their Christmas lists, and scattered observations about life. Her heart warmed, the small notes transporting her back to when her children were still young, their voices filling the house with laughter. But as she turned to the final entry, the nostalgic warmth turned cold. Jake's handwriting, shakier than in previous entries, filled the page. Santa came to our basement tonight. He looked different. His suit was torn, his beard wasn't real, and his eyes were strange. I don't think he's supposed to be here. I'm scared, Mommy. Please help us. Emily froze, her grip on the diary tightening as the words burned into her mind. She hadn't remembered Jake ever mentioning something like this. Her stomach twisted, and a wave of unease washed over her. The attic seemed darker now, the once distant creaks of the house settling suddenly sharper, closer. The silence pressed against her, the air somehow heavier. Shoving the diary under her arm, she clambered down the ladder, her heart pounding. Back in the light of the living room, Emily reread the entry, hoping the words would somehow shift, that she'd misunderstood. But there they were, the ink faded but indelible, Jake's words from years ago. Her children were grown now, miles away in college, but a nagging thought refused to leave her mind. Why hadn't they ever told her about this? And more unsettlingly, what had really happened in that basement all those years ago? Emily sat at the kitchen table, the diary splayed open before her, her mug of coffee untouched and growing cold. Outside, the glow of Christmas lights from neighboring houses flickered cheerfully, but the festive air seemed distant, almost mocking. She couldn't shake the sense of unease as she flipped through the pages, scanning the entries from Jake and Lily's childhood. At first, the diary's tone was innocent, even charming. Jake had written about building snow forts with Lily, sneaking extra cookies from the jar, and wondering if Santa would leave him the train set he desperately wanted. Lily's additions were simpler, doodles of reindeer, hearts, and a crude sketch of what appeared to be the family's Christmas tree. But then, as the entries progressed, a shift in tone emerged. Santa visited us early this year, one entry read. He didn't come through the chimney like you said, Mommy. He came from the basement stairs. He said it's a secret, and we shouldn't tell you, but it felt weird. Emily frowned. Jake and Lily had always been creative, spinning wild stories from their vivid imaginations. She could remember Jake concocting elaborate tales about knights and dragons, and Lily often joined in as his trusty sidekick. But this story didn't feel playful, it felt wrong. She turned the page. Another entry caught her eye, written in Jake's hand. Santa doesn't like the lights on. He told us to keep them off when he visits. He brings us presents, but he looks different from the pictures. He's really tall, and his suit doesn't fit him right. I think Lily likes him more than I do. She calls him her special Santa. Emily's chest tightened. Special Santa? She didn't recall her kids ever mentioning this term before. She kept reading, her unease growing with each entry. Santa said he'll only come back if we're really good and keep his secret. He said if we tell, he won't bring presents anymore. Lily says she likes him, but I don't. He smells funny, like Daddy's garage tools, and his hands are cold. Emily's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she closed the diary, her mind racing. Was this some elaborate prank her children had concocted all those years ago? Or had something more sinister been happening under her own roof without her noticing? She pushed the diary aside, her gaze drifting to the basement door at the far end of the hallway. The house felt impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that amplified every creak and groan of the old wooden floors. The basement. Her stomach churned at the thought. She hadn't been down there in months. It was just a storage space now, old holiday decorations, unused tools, and boxes she couldn't quite bring herself to throw out. But the words in the diary played over and over in her head, each repetition twisting her gut tighter. Santa came to our basement. Trying to shake the unease, Emily decided to call her son. Jake was studying engineering at a university on the West Coast, and though they hadn't spoken much recently, she hoped hearing his voice would steady her nerves. The phone rang several times before Jake answered, his voice groggy. "Hey, Mom, everything okay?" "Hi, sweetie, sorry to bother you. I found something today, your old Christmas diary. Do you remember writing in it with Lily?" There was a long pause. When Jake finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more cautious. "Yeah, I remember." "Jake," she hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. "What's all this about Santa visiting the basement? You never told me about that." Another pause. This time the silence stretched so long it made her skin crawl. "It was just a game, Mom," and he said finally, his tone clipped. "We were kids. We made stuff up." "But, Mom," Jake interrupted, his voice firm now, almost defensive. "It's nothing. Don't worry about it, okay? It's late. I'll call you tomorrow." The line went dead before she could respond. Emily stared at the phone in her hand, her heart pounding. Jake's response was too quick, too rehearsed. She knew her son well enough to recognize when he was hiding something, and the weight in her chest told her that whatever he wasn't saying, it was something she wasn't prepared to hear. Her gaze drifted back to the diary. The words on the final page burned into her mind like an accusation. "I'm scared, Mommy. Please help us." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The words in the diary kept replaying in her mind, a loop of unease that wouldn't let her rest. Each creak of the house, each groan of the old radiator, seemed amplified in the stillness. Lying in bed, she tried to convince herself that Jake was right. It was just a game, a childish story, but deep down, she knew better. At 2:47 a.m., unable to bear the oppressive silence, she got up and walked to the kitchen. The glow of the Christmas tree lights cast shifting patterns across the walls, and for a moment, she felt an odd comfort. But then her gaze drifted to the basement door. It stood there, unassuming, yet it seemed to beckon her, like a gaping void waiting to swallow her whole. The diary's words echoed in her mind. Santa came to our basement. She grabbed the flashlight from the junk drawer, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped the switch. The beam of light wavered against the basement door as she approached. With a deep breath, she twisted the cold brass knob and pulled it open. The stairs stretched downward, cloaked in shadow. She hesitated at the threshold, listening. The faint hum of the furnace was the only sound, but the air felt different, thicker, colder, as if the darkness itself had weight. Slowly she descended, each creak of the wooden steps making her wince. At the bottom, the beam of her flashlight swept across the space. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls. Old tools hung on rusted nails, and forgotten holiday decorations were piled in the corner. It all seemed ordinary, too ordinary. But as she scanned the room, her light caught something out of place. Against the far wall, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a wooden partition she didn't remember. It wasn't part of the basement's original layout. Her pulse quickened as she approached, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. The partition was makeshift, rough wooden planks nailed together hastily, as if someone had wanted to conceal whatever lay behind it. Emily hesitated, her fingers hovering over the edge of the wood. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, she gave it a sharp tug. The planks gave way with a groan, revealing a small hidden alcove. Inside, the beam of her flashlight illuminated a chilling sight. There were toys, old, dirty, and arranged in a circle. A tattered teddy bear sat in the center, its button eyes dull and lifeless. Around it were scattered items that made Emily's stomach turn. A rusted chain, a cracked porcelain doll with a missing arm, and a child's shoe that looked eerily familiar. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. Who had done this? And why? Her breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away from the alcove, the flashlight's beam darting wildly around the room. But then she froze. From somewhere above her, directly beneath the living room floor, came a sound. A faint creak, followed by a soft thump, like someone walking. Emily's blood ran cold. The house was supposed to be empty. Clutching the flashlight like a weapon, she forced herself to move toward the stairs, her legs trembling with each step. Reaching the top, she hesitated just before opening the door, straining to hear. The sound was gone, replaced by the oppressive silence she'd come to dread. She stepped into the kitchen and locked the basement door behind her, leaning against it as her mind raced. Was someone in the house? She checked every window and door, finding them all securely locked. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to her, as if the shadows themselves were alive. The next morning, Emily decided she needed answers. She retrieved the diary again and pored over it, looking for any clue she might have missed. One entry in particular stood out, written in Lily's smaller, more childlike handwriting. Santa says he likes our house because it's quiet. He says he has a special place here where he hides his presents, but we're not allowed to look until he says it's okay. Emily's stomach churned. A special place. Was the alcove in the basement what Lily had meant? She called her daughter, desperate for answers. Lily, now 20 and living out of state, sounded surprised to hear from her. "Lily, sweetie, I found your old diary," Emily began carefully. "Do you remember writing about Santa visiting the basement?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Lily's voice came, hesitant and uneasy. "Why are you bringing this up, Mom?" "Because I need to know," Emily pressed. "What did you mean by special Santa? And what's this about a special place?" Another pause, heavier this time. When Lily spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "We thought he was just playing a game. But sometimes it didn't feel like a game." "What didn't feel like a game, Lily?" Emily demanded, her voice rising. Lily hesitated, then finally admitted, "Jake said he heard Santa's voice even when we weren't playing. From the basement." Emily's hand tightened around the phone, her knuckles white. She glanced at the locked basement door, her pulse pounding in her ears. Emily spent the rest of the day in a haze of anxiety, her mind racing with fragmented thoughts. The strange alcove in the basement, Lily's hesitant admission, Jake's abrupt dismissal. It all pointed to something she couldn't yet piece together, but her gut told her it was worse than she dared imagine. By nightfall, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. Determined to get answers, she decided to search the basement again. This time, she armed herself with a crowbar and her phone, its flashlight app ready. She didn't know what she was expecting to find, but she felt certain she couldn't face this mystery unprepared. As she descended the creaking stairs, the air grew colder, heavier. The uncovered alcove loomed at the far end of the basement, its darkness seeming to stretch and breathe on its own. She approached cautiously, her flashlight casting sharp, eerie shadows on the rough stone walls. This time she noticed something she'd missed before, faint scratches on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged. They formed a trail leading behind the alcove, where the wall met the floor. Swallowing her fear, she crouched down and ran her fingers along the seam, discovering a hidden latch buried beneath years of dust. Her heart pounded as she pried it open, revealing a concealed crawlspace. The flashlight's beam struggled to penetrate the narrow tunnel, but what she could see made her stomach drop. Tattered fabric, red velvet, like the remnants of a Santa suit, hung in shreds from the tunnel's walls. Strewn across the dirt floor were small items, broken toys, empty candy wrappers, and a single Polaroid photograph. Emily's hand shook as she picked up the photo. It was faded and warped, but the image was unmistakable. Jake and Lily, no older than 7 and 5, stood in the basement with a man dressed as Santa. His face was obscured, turned slightly away from the camera, but his towering frame and the ill-fitting suit were eerily familiar. She staggered back, the photo slipping from her grasp. Her mind raced. How was this possible? Who had taken this picture, and why hadn't she ever known about it? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound that sent icy fear coursing through her veins. The unmistakable creak of a floorboard above her head. Someone was in the house. Her breath caught as she turned off her flashlight, plunging the basement into darkness. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, straining to listen. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, as if whoever, or whatever it was, knew she was there. Clutching the crowbar tightly, she inched toward the stairs. Each movement felt impossibly loud, the sound of her breathing deafening in the oppressive silence. Reaching the bottom step, she froze. The basement door above her was ajar, a faint light spilling through. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she nearly dropped the crowbar in fright. Pulling it out, she saw Jake's name on the screen. She answered in a whisper, her voice trembling. "Jake, someone's in the house." There was a long pause before Jake spoke. His voice was low, strained. "Mom, listen to me. Don't go upstairs. Just stay where you are." "What? Jake, what's going on? Who is it?" "Mom," Jake interrupted, his voice tight with urgency. "He's still there, the man from the basement. We didn't tell you because we didn't think you'd believe us, but he never left." Emily's blood ran cold. Her grip on the crowbar tightened as her mind reeled. "What do you mean, never left?" "I mean," Jake said, his voice breaking, "he's been watching us for years. I heard him whispering through the vents. Lily thought it was Santa, but I knew it wasn't. He said he'd hurt us if we told you." Tears streamed down Emily's face as the weight of Jake's confession sank in. She had failed to protect her children, oblivious to the horror unfolding under her own roof. A sudden thud from upstairs snapped her back to the present. The footsteps were heading toward the basement door. "Mom, get out of there!" Jake's voice was frantic. "Run!" Emily didn't think. She bolted up the stairs, her heart pounding as she slammed the door shut behind her and locked it. She could hear the handle rattle, the sound of someone trying to force it open. She stumbled back into the kitchen, her phone slipping from her grasp. The house was no longer her sanctuary, it was a trap, and somewhere within it was the man who had haunted her family for years. The house was alive with noise now. The thud of footsteps, the violent rattle of the locked basement door. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she grabbed her phone off the floor. Her trembling fingers fumbled as she dialed 911, but the call went through. "911, what's your emergency?" "There's someone in my house," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "He's been in my basement. I don't know for how long. Please, you have to send someone." The operator's calm response barely registered. Emily backed into the living room, gripping the crowbar like a lifeline. Her eyes darted around the dimly lit space, every shadow a potential threat. Then the rattling stopped. The sudden silence was worse. Emily froze, her entire body tensed. The stillness seemed to stretch, the quiet so deep she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. And then, from the hallway, she heard it, a voice, low and hoarse, calling out, "Emily." She staggered backward, the crowbar clattering to the floor. The voice was wrong, familiar yet warped, as though it had been pulled from a memory and twisted into something unrecognizable. "Emily," the voice called again. Closer now. "It's me, Santa." Her stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. She forced herself to move, scrambling to pick up the crowbar. As she backed toward the front door, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. A figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway, towering and thin, dressed in the tattered remnants of a red suit. His face was obscured by a matted, filthy beard, but his eyes, sunken, gleaming with malice, were fixed on her. "Why are you running?" the man crooned, his voice dripping with mockery. "I've been so good to your family." Emily's fingers found the lock on the front door, but before she could turn it, the man lunged. She screamed as he grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. The smell of him, sweat, decay, and something metallic, was overpowering. With a surge of adrenaline, she swung the crowbar, catching him across the shoulder. He grunted, momentarily loosening his grip, and she shoved him away with all her strength. He stumbled but didn't fall, his expression twisting into something feral. "You can't stop me," he snarled, his voice losing its mocking tone. "You think you can take back what's mine?" She didn't wait to find out what he meant. Flinging the door open, she bolted outside, the cold night air hitting her like a shock. She ran into the street, screaming for help. The Christmas lights adorning the neighboring houses blinked cheerfully, but no one emerged. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement at her own house. The man was standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the light. He didn't chase her. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed, his expression unreadable in the darkness. Then, without a word, he retreated back into the house and closed the door. Emily stood trembling, unsure if her legs would hold her. The sound of distant sirens finally broke through her terror, and moments later, red and blue lights flooded the street. 2 officers stepped out, weapons drawn. She ran to them, her words tumbling out in frantic bursts. "He's inside. He's been in my basement for years. He attacked me. Please, you have to get him." The officers wasted no time. They entered the house, leaving Emily trembling in the cold. Minutes felt like hours as she stood outside, watching the darkened windows of her home. The crackle of their radios and muffled voices were the only sounds. Finally, one of the officers emerged, his expression grim. "Ma'am, we searched the entire house. There's no one inside." Emily's heart sank. "That's impossible. He was just there. He grabbed me. He spoke to me." The officer's gaze softened, but his tone remained firm. "There's no sign of anyone, but we did find something in the basement." He gestured for her to follow. With hesitant steps, she re-entered the house, the warmth of the interior now tainted by fear. The officers led her to the basement, where the alcove gaped like a wound. Inside, they had uncovered more items: a crude mattress, empty food cans, and a collection of Polaroid photographs. Emily's stomach turned as she recognized the photos. They were of her family, taken over the years, some from angles that could only have been inside the house. In one, she was asleep on the couch, her children playing on the floor beside her. In another, Jake and Lily were unwrapping Christmas presents, their joy oblivious to the unseen watcher. And then there was the last photo, a close-up of Emily herself, taken from just behind her shoulder. The timestamp on the corner was from 2 nights ago. Emily sat at the police station later that night, wrapped in a scratchy blanket, her mind spinning in an endless loop of disbelief and terror. The officers were kind, but cautious, their questions measured, their responses clinical. They promised to keep investigating, but the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. The man who had haunted her family for years had vanished without a trace. When she finally returned home, the house felt like a stranger, cold, silent, and heavy with the weight of what had been uncovered. The basement door stood wide open, a reminder of the horrors hidden just below her feet. She didn't bother to close it. She wasn't sure she could bring herself to touch it ever again. Over the next few days, Emily tried to go about her life. She called Jake and Lily repeatedly, reassuring them that everything was fine, while begging them to tell her anything else they remembered. Jake stayed distant, his guilt palpable in every short, clipped response. Lily was more forthcoming, but didn't have much more to share. Only vague memories of strange noises, odd smells, and a sense of unease that they had learned to ignore. The house refused to let her move on. Each night she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her ears straining against the silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint gust of wind outside felt amplified, impossible to ignore. She started leaving every light in the house on, the warm glow doing little to banish the shadows that seemed to press closer with each passing night. And then the whispers started. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of her exhausted mind. Faint, almost imperceptible murmurs that came and went so quickly she convinced herself they weren't real. But as the nights wore on, they grew louder, more distinct. Emily, she bolted upright in bed one night, her heart hammering in her chest. The voice had been so clear, so close, as if someone had leaned down to speak directly into her ear. She grabbed the crowbar she now kept by her bedside and searched the entire house, room by room, her breath hitching at every shadow. But there was no one there. Still, the whispers continued. Sometimes they came from the walls, other times from the vents. Once she swore she heard them coming from the basement. She refused to go down there, even in daylight. The alcove was sealed now, boarded up by the officers, but she could feel its presence like a wound festering beneath her home. She tried to explain it away. Stress, lack of sleep, her imagination running wild. But deep down, she knew the truth. He had left something behind. Whether it was his physical presence or the memory of his years-long invasion, the house was no longer hers. It belonged to him now. One night, as she sat in the living room, staring blankly at the Christmas tree, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from Jake. "Mom, are you okay? I just had the weirdest dream. I thought I saw Santa outside my dorm window. He was looking right at me." Emily's blood turned to ice. Her hands trembled as she typed back. "Jake, don't joke about that. It's not funny." A long pause, then another text. "I'm not joking." The message was followed by a photo. It was blurry, taken through a window, but there was no mistaking the figure. A tall, gaunt man in a tattered red suit stood on the sidewalk, staring up at Jake's window. The same matted beard, the same hollow eyes. Emily dropped the phone, her breathing shallow. The house seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing deeper. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint creak of a floorboard. "Emily!" The whisper was louder this time, closer. Her eyes darted to the basement door. It was closed now, though she didn't remember closing it. A soft thump echoed from below, followed by a faint, rasping chuckle. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered once, then went out, plunging the room into darkness.